Today we are going to be talking about Snorlax, which is a bit of a rarity in the TCG. This time one of the more obscure Snorlaxes that we've actually talked about on the channel before when I did my video on cards that have special markers or counters, because today we're going all in on Hungry Snorlax. Another Japanese exclusive promo to kind of piggyback off of the vending series decks we've been doing. During a special promotion, if you bought an N64, you would get a pamphlet that included Cool Porygon and Hungry Snorlax. Hungry Snorlax even came with some physical counters to use with the card. As we'll get into here in a second, this card uses food counters. For one colorless energy, Snorlax can eat and place one of these food counters on itself. It can have 2 food counters on it at any given time, with one of the most noteworthy things about this card being that there's no way for your opponent to ever remove these. Even if Snorlax gets kicked to the bench, even if you use Pokemon Center on it, these food counters will stay on Snorlax. Then for 3 colorless, you can use Rollout, which is 20 plus 30 more damage for every food counter that you remove from Snorlax. So once you get Snorlax set up with 1 or 2 food counters, you can then use Rollout to deal some pretty big damage. And it's not a must remove food counter, it's really you have the choice. So depending on the scenario, if you've got a fully set up Hungry Snorlax, you can deal either 20, 50, or 80 damage depending on whatever you want to do. As a 100 HP basic, that's a pretty reasonable setup too. So really all you have to figure out is what type of deck does this type of card actually fit into? What are the best support cards to actually get Snorlax set up and dealing that maximum damage? This build I'm about to show in particular is base Rocket, but there's really only one Rocket card in there, so by removing that, it can easily become a base Fossil build too. Credit goes to Jason Klaczynski for the deck list. I've just altered it just a tad to match my playstyle a little more as I was playtesting this deck, so let's get into it. So we're going to start off with Hungry Snorlax. He is the star of the deck after all. I'm going to be using 3 copies of Hungry Snorlax. I did try it with 4 just so I could kind of shift the focus a little more on there, but it ended up just, I had one in my hand that I didn't want to put on the bench, and it wasn't really worth setting up the food counters on multiple Snorlaxes, so 3 is definitely enough. And we're also going to include the best Pokemon in base Fossil, which is Lickitung, another big, bulky, normal type with a really good attack for only 1 energy. We're going to be running a full playset of those because they are so handy to start games with. Not only are they going to be able to absorb damage, they're also resistant to Psychic, which was a big base Fossil type with those promo Mewtwo's flying around everywhere, as well as Mr. Mime, but also that Tongue Wrap attack is really great. Same thing for Scyther, which any deck that has Scyther and Lickitung in it, I'm already sold. Scyther's going to help resist those fighting types like Hitmonchan and sometimes Machamp, depending on what type of format you're playing in. So Scyther and Lickitung both are going to play the roles of damage sponge, but also alternative attackers depending on what you're up against. Mewtwo's going to be more of a utility card and backup attacker. Mewtwo's for a little later in the game when you've already had a couple Pokemon knocked out, you've got plenty of basic energy in your discard. That's going to set up Mewtwo very nicely for energy absorption and then a Psyburn. Mr. Mime, only 1 copy of that because it's also going to be a stall card depending on what type of scenario you're in, but also backup attacker for if there's a lot of Pokemon that already have damage counters on them spread across your opponent's bench. 1 copy of Fossil Ghastly for very much the same reason. It's got a pretty solid 1 energy attack that fits with the energy type of the deck, but also it has utility in that energy conversion to where it can get Psychic energy back into your hand. This deck runs double colorless energy, so why not throw in a copy of Ditto as well, because those double colorless turn into double rainbows basically, and Ditto is going to be an amazing counter against Rain Dance as well as opposing promo Mewtwo's. And then finally 1 copy of Fossil Psyduck for that headache attack, which is kind of the ultimate stall tactic if you need a couple more turns to get your counter set up to get the right energy on Pokemon, because that's going to stop your opponent from playing any last energy removal, anything that's going to help them on their side of things, because energy removal, it really is the biggest obstacle to this deck since it's going to be able to discard those double colorless, but the rest of this deck is built around getting those energy back, or at least being able to attack for only 1 energy to stall and deal a little bit of damage while you're building up your Snorlax. And that's why cards like Pokemon Center, which we got 2 copies of, and then 2 copies of Mr. Fuji, are amazing for this deck, because you can just scoop up or completely heal any of the Pokemon that have damage on them. you're not going to lose a whole lot of energy, because if you're looking across all of these resource Pokemon, you're not really going to be losing all that much. And even if you do have to discard energy, you can get those back with Mewtwo, with Ghastly. If your Hungry Snorlax already has some food counters on it, you don't want to use Scoop Up and return it to your hand. That's one of the only ways you can kind of lose them. But Pokemon Center is a great option for if you've only got one energy on there anyway. If you've been saving the double colorless where you're a little more in the clear, you can just get that Snorlax out there with a couple of food counters on it already, and then hit for the 80 damage just by dropping a DCE on your turn. That's really how this deck shines so brightly, just from playtesting that I've done, is that you can stall a lot early game just with your Lickitung, your Mime, moving a Scyther back and forth. 3 copies of Professor Oak are gonna be your main resource gathering tool. You're not going to really need all 3 of them. Just run 3 so you can get one early game. And then your stall tactics are also going to rely heavily on energy removal and super energy removal, running a playset of each. And like I said, with most of these Pokemon, you only need 1 energy anyway. A lot of them are just resource cards that you're not going to be dropping until you really need them. So in the same way that this deck doesn't really mind getting hit with a bunch of energy removals itself, you can discard all the energy you want for super energy removals to do the same to your opponent without too many ill effects, since you can always just bring in a promo Mewtwo late game and sweep with those energy absorption Cyburn combos. 3 copies of Item Finder to help recycle a lot of these trainer cards, particularly Fuji, Scoop Up, and Pokemon Center, depending on what type of scenario you find yourself in. A couple copies of Gust of Wind just to get off some of those easy kills, prevent your opponent from getting something too big set up. Couple copies of Energy Retrieval, which is also going to help you get some of those basic energies back. And then a couple copies of Nightly Garbage Run, which is the one rocket card that is featured in this deck. So if you just want to replace that with maybe a couple other copies of Energy Retrieval or a Super Energy Retrieval, then the deck's going to run pretty much the same for base Fossil. Full playset of double colorless energy for your Hungry Snorlaxes, but also that 1 Ditto if you do need to quickly counter something that your opponent has set up very quickly. The immediate thing that comes to mind is if your opponent just Pokemon breeders straight up from a Squirtle into a Blastoise. You want to be able to threaten that Rain Dance setup very quickly so that you can kind of take care of it, scare your opponent a little bit, stall psychologically, not just through gameplay. 4 copies of Grass Energy for if you do want to attack with Scyther Slash Attack, do that whole setup. But they'll also work for Lickitung, Ditto, and Hungry Snorlax, so the rest of the deck's going to be filled out with Psychic Energy for your Psychic-specific Pokemon, and that's going to wrap it up. So the burning question is, how good is this deck really? And it's pretty damn good, actually. I played it against a lot of different base Fossil and base Rocket archetypes. It handles Psychic types very well, so you're covered on Damage Swap and promo Mewtwo Haymakers. It responds very well to your regular Haymaker, with Electabuzz really being the problematic card there. It can struggle against Rain Dance, especially those Turbo Blastoise builds where you really have your setup turn 2. This deck can be a little slow responding to that. But out of all the matchups, the one that was actually hardest for this deck was Arcanine, because it has a similar strategy of slowly building up, dealing with smaller threats with Magmar, which only needs 1 or 2 energy, and then dropping a DCE onto an Arcanine to hit you for a lot of damage. With the help of plus power and some defenders, Arcanine's going to be able to OHKO everything in this deck and deal minimal damage to itself in the process, which is a reminder that in base Fossil or base Rocket, never sleep on a budget deck. Since this can be such a technical deck, it may be worth substituting in a couple copies of Computer Search if you're not quite able to draw exactly what you need, or if you find yourself being forced to discard some of your valuable resources from Professor Oak, then you may also want to substitute those for Bill. But also, as with every build, you can kind of adjust the number of cards depending on whatever your playstyle is, whatever's gonna fit whatever decks you anticipate being up against the best. Like I said, this deck list is coming more from Jason Klaczynski's blog, so I will link that down in the description so you guys can go check that out. Channel regular PTCG Dark also beat me to the punch in getting a Hungry Snorlax deck posted to his channel, so that's another alternative deck list that you can go check out. I've had a lot of fun deck building around these Japanese exclusive cards, really digging into how it would have changed overall gameplay. So if you guys have any Japanese exclusive cards that you'd like to see decks built around, let me know down in the comments. Or if you've played that Game Boy Color TCG sequel that has a lot of these Japanese cards included, hit me up with some fun strategies. And until next video, bye.